Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm Paul TX141 Walsh and welcome to some more Gran Turismo Sport, a racing game developed by Untitled Digital and published by Sony Interactive Entertainment for the PlayStation 4. Focusing on the game's online mode, known as Sport Mode, in this episode I take a look at my performance in the 5th race of the first stage of the 2019 Manufacturer Series season, which was a Group 4 race held at a Sardegna Road Track B number 2 circuit. With that, let's get racing. Taking a look at the grid then, you'll see that I qualified on pole with a 128.3. My story for qualifying, it was a tense session. In the 2 fast laps I gave myself, the first one I had to back out of as I came up behind a slower runner who was also on a fast lap and I didn't want to cause problems for their lap. And on my final fast lap, I made a mistake going into turn 5 which cost me a significant amount of time, but I was just able to make up for it in sector 3, fantastic sector which I really enjoy in the NSX, and that was enough to put me on pole by a small margin over the Toyota GT86 in second. Now my strategy for this race, it was a 9-lap race, a sprint race, and there would be no need for a pit stop as fuel was not a concern, however tyre wear was a concern. In that we're all racing on the racing hard compound, there was no option to switch to another compound, and that tyre wear would become a problem as we went into the second half of the race. In my case it would be from lap 6 onwards, where the front left tyre in particular would be receiving a considerable amount of punishment compared to the other tyres, as this track had a good number of right hand corners, some of them being medium to high speed corners such as turn 2, some of them being high braking zones and lower speed corners such as turn 8. And what I'd find is, going from lap 6 onwards, the grip available to me on that front left tyre would be significantly less compared to the earlier stages of the race, and I could no longer push at 100% on that tyre compared to in the earlier laps, and if I tried to do that then I'd be heading off the track into a gravel trap, into a wall or off onto the grass. So you'll see from lap 6 onwards I will have to start coming off on my pace, dropping down to about 95 to 90%. But my opening plan as we come to the end of the grid of 20 cars, always being B driver rating, my opening plan would be to push as hard as possible after lap 1, let the tyres get up to their standard warmth, and then from lap 2 up to lap 4 if not lap 5, push as hard as possible to try and extend the gap between myself and the guys behind to well over a second, so that way I'm not able to benefit from the slipstream of my car and I can just manage the race accordingly. So we're about to get underway with a rolling start. I've got the racing radar available to me in the bottom centre of the screen in case somebody does come up the inside or on the side of the car or right up behind me. And as we're heading down to the straight, as soon as I get control of the car, you'll see me pull over to the left hand side of the straight as I want to try and make the GT86 follow me over to that side, just so that way they're not immediately picking up the benefit of a direct slipstream. They're going to have to follow me around if they want it. Because what I thought was the GT86 would not be as fast on a straight compared to my car, at least as we're accelerating up to higher speeds. Perhaps they'd have the better top end speed, but at least in this acceleration instance they won't be able to gain too much and they start falling back to the guys behind. And as we go through turn 1 here, we get through relatively cleanly, albeit I let the car drift a little bit onto the grass there, 2 wheels on the grass, which gives the GT86 the ability to close up to me half a second off my backside now. As we come through turn 2 and down into the sweeping right-handers of turns 3 and 4, a lovely extended corner set this, and we come through nicely to end the first sector, now go down the hill towards the left-hander at turn 5. Braking sharply and tucking it nicely in, we can see that the GT86 behind gets a little bit sideways and misses the apex. Perhaps that's through the lack of downforce of them running in the slipstream of my car, and that causes them to drift onto the gravel out of turn 5 and fall back to the guys in 3rd and 4th, and now they've got a battle on their hands to hold on to 2nd place. And you'll see now, based on that knowledge that I've seen them fall back, I'm just going to go for it, because I feel the tyres are up to their standard warmth, what I'd expect them to be, and now I can just absolutely pound the car around the track for 5 laps and pull as much distance as possible from the guys behind, so that way this race becomes something that I can control my way to victory rather than feel under pressure all the way to the very end. So coming through sector 3 now, turns 10 in particular here, so we come out of 9 into 10 and now into 11, the right hander here. going down to second gear and getting on the throttle, and very shortly we're going to be switching over to the replay camera because I'm absolutely going to go for it on lap number 2, which I found was my lap where I could put in my best lap time because the car would have maximum grip effectively, and whilst it'd have a lot of fuel in the car as we cross the start finish line to begin lap number 2, whilst it'd have a lot of fuel, this was the lap where I could throw the car around and have confidence in the car's abilities. So going through turn 1 here, we throw it in nicely, tucking it on the apex there, coming out at about 80 miles an hour and then going down into the extended right hand that is turn 2, just lifting as we go into the corner to let the nose bite a little bit tighter into the corner, and then we get on the throttle coming out, come through the sweeping right handers here, turns 3 and 4, getting that nicely done out onto the curve there, now ending sector 1, coming down the hill into sector 2, turn 5, slamming on the brake nicely, getting on the apex on that inner curve and then letting the car roll out momentum wise as we now come onto the back straight here and go charging up the hill, the little kink at turn 6 and then up the hill into turn 7, and as we go charging up here in 4th gear, we're hitting the limiter, braking up the 50 board down into second gear, getting it nice and tight on the corner here, not completely tight on the curve, not to worry, I prefer a slightly wider line typically there, so we let the car roll out, and now we're coming down the hill into turn 8, the right hander that's quite tight, and if you get on the power too early you end up going off into the gravel, getting on the throttle from second gear, going all the way up into 4th gear now as we come through the extended chicane here, turns 9 and 10, going through 9 at the moment and then switching back into turn 10, the left-hander, and ending the lap with turn 11, a little bit of smoke coming off the right-hand wheels there, probably off of the brakes, and now out of turn 11, get a wonderful exit, get on the throttle nicely, and just charge down towards the start-finish straight to end lap number 2 and start lap number 3, and we set a time as we come across the line here of a 1:28.4. which we reckon is going to be our fastest lap, or at the time I thought would be my fastest lap in this race, based on the fact I absolutely hammered it, and now tyre wear is going to become a small factor, and we can see that the gap between myself and second place has already extended out to 2.8 seconds, and it looks as though the GT86 who was in second has dropped back to third, and now I believe it's the Belgian in the Hyundai in second place who's trying to chase after us. But as we come out of sector 1 and down the hill again into sector 2 here, we can see that that gap in the region of 3 to 3.1 seconds is gradually going to extend out over the distance of this lap. And it really feels great at this point to be in control of the race pace, as though I've got 3 seconds between myself and the guys behind. I can't let off at the moment, I want to keep pushing that gap a little bit further out, but I'm not going to overdo it. And the reason I want to talk about this a little bit is because this is something I've noticed a good number of racing drivers do, particularly one of my favourite racing drivers, albeit he's sometimes a controversial figure, in Lewis Hamilton. Now what I've noticed with Lewis Hamilton in particular, and this is what I'm trying to employ here, is that if he's leading from the start of a race, he'll normally try to get a gap of say 3 to 5 seconds over second place, and then what he'll do, he won't back out of it completely, but he'll no longer be running the car at say 100% compared to the guys behind, but instead starts to manage his pace to the guys behind, so that way he's always maintaining a gap of say 3 to 5 seconds. Not letting the gap increase anymore, but not letting it drop. And if the guys behind start to drive a little bit faster, then he reacts by driving a little bit faster to match their pace. And what this does, it creates, I would argue, a sense of frustration as we come across the line onto lap 4, and we can see the gap between myself and second place is now 3.6 seconds. So the gap has increased by another half a second over lap number 3. And this creates frustration in the guys behind if we're talking about the mental game here, in the fact that those guys, whenever they try to push harder to close the gap, if they suddenly see that they've pushed harder but that gap hasn't come down because the guy in first is suddenly pushing harder, then they have to push even harder than they were previously to try and close the gap. And what it can do effectively is force them into a mistake because they're so focused on trying to literally throw the car around the track at perhaps above their standard 100% race pace, and now kicking it up to 110 or 120%, that they're more prone to making mistakes, and the mental pressure's on them and not the leader in order to maintain that pace and get back in the fight for first, whereas the leader can just react. And it's a nice way of driving, I feel, that when you're in that situation where you just react to what's happening behind, but you're not under any direct pressure. I'm not under pressure right now, I'm not being attacked as such, as I get a little bit sideways there coming out of turn 8 because I just rode a little bit on the tiny curb coming out of 8 on the inside, and that's something I have to be careful of. Riding on these very thin curves, if you got it wrong and put one tyre on the grass and then tried to turn the wheel in to the corner, what ended up happening is the car would actually end up straight lining over the curve and have a higher chance of going off unless you controlled your speed accordingly. So what you see is I am trying to avoid riding on those very tiny little curves, or just very gradually grazing, because I don't want to go over them for the reasons I've just mentioned. As we come to the end of lap 4 and begin lap 5, and we can see, looking in the bottom left hand corner of your screen in terms of tyre wear, that the front left tyre is already showing considerably more wear than the other tyres, and that's only going to become more prominent as we go into the later laps. Now I should talk a little bit about the setup of the car I'm using here. I'm using a brake balance of -4, which means I'm shifting a considerable amount of the brake balance towards the front of the car. Now I'm doing this because the Honda NSX is a mid-engine rear-wheel drive car in this setup in the Group 4 category. And what that means is, as standard, I would expect, and based on my initial testing with brake balance of 0, that there is a significant amount of oversteer in the car rather than understeer, because the weight distribution is towards the back of the car naturally. So by setting the brake balance towards the front, I'm actually invoking understeer in the car, and what you'll notice, the setup I do have with -4 brake balance does cause the car to understeer a bit, and you're going to see an example here as we go into turn 8. Watch how I experience understeer when I brake initially, and I had to really force the car to turn in. I actually missed getting tight to the apex there. But I prefer the car in this manner, that it's got understeer rather than oversteer, because I feel as though whilst I've got to fight the car sometimes to get it to tuck into the tighter corners, such as turn 8, and you're also going to see that happen to an extent when we go through turn 5, albeit we haven't got as much wear in the front right tyre, so it's not going to be as difficult, it makes the car very enjoyable to drive for me, and it's my preferred driving style. A car with a bit of understeer rather than significant amounts of oversteer, and I think that's why I like the Group 4 NSX so much, is because I've tweaked the setup in order to get it into that driving configuration that suits my personal driving style. I completed lap 5 and coming on to lap 6, and now you're going to see that I am starting to come off of my 100% pace. Now coming out to turn 1, my exit speed was 77 miles an hour, whereas I've been trying to aim for 80 to 82 miles an hour every lap prior to that. As for the gap between myself and the guys behind, it's 5.1 seconds to second place now, so I've got that gap even further out, and I haven't been overly doing it in order to try and extend the gap. It looks though perhaps those guys have been fighting a bit, and that's caused the gap to extend even further. Alternatively, I'm just the faster driver at this point in the race, and perhaps we can accredit it to that simply because nobody set a faster lap than the lap I set on lap number 2, that 1:28.4, which surprisingly is only 1/10 off of my qualifying lap that was good enough for pole. And I should point out at this point, I was actually trying to target a 1:28.0 or 1:27.9 for qualifying, so the mistake I made was a considerable one, and I did have a bit more qualifying pace there, and I guess it's a reflection again of the practice I've put into this race, and you're seeing the results on screen right now. But rather than overdo it in terms of a lack of self-modesty or self-honesty, let's go charging around the track once more, coming into turn 11. And what you can see is getting that nicely synced up. I'm very cautious not to let the car roll too much out onto the exit curb there on the outside of the track. And the reason for that is, if you went beyond the white track limits there, so the white lines, you had a very high chance by going out onto that curb and stay on the curb that you would pick up anywhere in the region of a 2 to 3.5 second penalty. And the penalty zone on this track is in a very odd position, I personally feel, albeit I'm not complaining. It's right before going into turn 9, whereas I expect there to be a penalty zone perhaps on that back straight coming out to turn 5 and heading up towards turns 6 and 7, or a penalty zone on the start finish straight. But it seems to be situated just before the extended chicane at turns 9 and 10. And it's a penalty you don't really want to pick up for a whole lap, knowing that you've got a 2 to 3.5 second penalty to take when you're going through that wonderful section towards the end of each lap. But coming back to what we're doing right now, we can see that gap is extending even further to the region of 6 seconds. This race is in the bag, and what I'm actually thinking to myself right now is, whilst we're dropping our pace down to say 95 to 90% because of the tyre wear, we can, if we decide to, just drop it off a little bit further. And by doing so, don't lose focus on the race, because if we lose focus now, then there's a chance we could make a mistake which brings our opponents back into contention, but at the same time we don't need to overdo it. And I've seen racing drivers in Formula 1, and I believe Ayrton Senna would be an example of this, who just continue to drive at that maximum possible pace regardless of how far their opponents were behind them, and in the end they did make mistakes because they're trying to thrash the car so hard when they're not under pressure to do so, and that's caused them to make a mistake which put them in the wall, and as a result they just lost the race completely, or they made a mistake that's allowed their opponents to get back up behind them and start fighting for for first place. So that's what I'm trying to avoid here. I'm trying to balance my concentration as we switch back to the replay camera for lap number 8. And the reason I'm doing this is you get a third person perspective on how I'm changing my racing line slightly as we come out to turn 1 here due to the tyre wear now in effect. And the only difference really is you're going to see that I'm a little bit more hesitant to get on the throttle too early, particularly in these higher speed corners. I don't want to end up throwing the car off the circuit. As we come 3 and 4 here, again coming down to second gear going into turn 4 and then getting on the throttle. I'm not getting on the throttle as early to avoid going all the way out onto that outside curb and potentially drifting out into the gravel. And same here with turn 5, I'm not getting on the throttle as early because what I don't want to do is let the car drift onto the gravel. Alternatively, if I get my braking zone wrong there, I don't want to cut the inside of turn 1.5 too much to end up putting my left hand wheels on the grass, and that will cause the car to slide sideways. The back end will come out because of the dropping gradient on the corner, and if I do that I've got a chance of sliding off into the gravel, and that can cause mayhem. Now, one other thing I should point out as we're coming towards the end of the lap now, so we're coming out of Sector 2, going on to Sector 3, so turns 9 and 10 coming up, is that in the qualifying session, when I was behind some drivers, I actually used the time behind the drivers to experiment with what the car would handle like if I was in the tow of another car. And I found on this circuit in particular, being in someone's slipstream is very beneficial on the straights, but it can be very difficult to get used to when you're going through some of the higher speed corners, particularly turn 2, turns 3 and 4, and the chicane at 9 and 10. And as a result, I was very happy to have got on pole because I didn't have to deal with that, and the fact that I pulled the gap from second place right at the start meant that was never going to be a factor in my race, but it was something on my mind, thinking ahead. And here you can see that tyre wear come to effect. As I do make a mistake, I overextend the braking point on turn 1 and go off onto the grass. I thought, right, just naturally let the car get back on track, don't do anything silly, don't spin the car out by getting on the throttle too early, just let the car come back onto the track naturally. And you can see that I have lost in the region of 0.8 to 1 second there, but it's not time I couldn't afford to lose, as the gap's now dropped down to 5.7 seconds as we come out of Sector 1 onto Sector 2, out of turn 5 already on this final lap, and I'm just taking it nice and easy for the rest of the lap now. Let the gap drop a little bit because there's no pressure here, as long as we don't make a silly mistake, and there's no need to make a silly mistake now. We just got to bring the car home, bring it home in first place. So as we come through turn 7 here, wonderful corner, this is in the change of gradient and the banking of the corner. Now over the brow of the hill, down into turn 8, braking down to second gear, just gradually letting the car come around very lightly on the throttle at first, but then build up that speed as you let the car roll out onto the outer curb. And now going into turn 9, up into 4th gear here, we've got a back marker coming up, but they'll be getting out of the way because of the blue flags. Coming through turn 10 now, braking down to second gear for the final time, going through turn 11, getting on the power here, getting on the power later, not letting the car roll out to pick up a penalty, and now just down the straight to end the race and bring the Group 4 NSX home in first place, picking up our second win for Honda, and that's the story. Having had time to reflect, this race represents another personal milestone for me in that it was my first perfect race. I put the car on pole, I brought it home in first, and along the way I picked up the fastest lap of the race distance. And what a track to do it on. This Sardegna instance being a fantastic circuit to race on, and one I can recommend to anyone who plays GT Sport. But unfortunately we've got to leave this track behind now and move on to the 6th race at the Santa Cruz circuit, B number 2 in particular, on Saturday the 13th of July. As always, thank you for watching. If you did enjoy this video, be sure to leave a like, comment or subscribe for future episodes. I have been TX141, and until next time, take care and drive safely.